Arsinoe II was 15 years old when her father sold her like livestock, not metaphorically sold, actually sold. Handed over to a foreign king as part of a military alliance, like a particularly valuable horse or a piece of fertile land. Her father, Ptolemy I of Egypt, didn't even pretend it was about her happiness or future. This was business. Pure, calculated business. The buyer was Lysimachus, king of Thrace. He was 55 years old. Think about that for a moment. A teenage girl being delivered to a man old enough to be her grandfather. Lysimachus wasn't just old. He was a veteran general covered in battle scars, missing part of his ear from a lion attack, and known throughout the Greek world for his violent temper and paranoid tendencies. This was the man Ptolemy chose to give his daughter to. The wedding took place in 300 BCE, and it was exactly as romantic as it sounds. Arsinoe was dressed in ceremonial robes, paraded in front of foreign dignitaries, and handed over to Lysimachus like a diplomatic gift. Her father didn't even stay for the entire ceremony. He had already gotten what he wanted from the deal, a military alliance that would protect Egypt's northern borders. Arsinoe's feelings about marrying a man 4 decades older than her, completely irrelevant. But wait, it gets worse. Lysimachus already had wives, multiple wives, and children from those marriages who were Arsinoe's age or older. She wasn't joining a royal household as the honored queen. She was being added to a collection, one more young woman to provide heirs and political legitimacy to an aging king's ambitions. The wedding night was witnessed. Royal advisors and officials stood outside the bedchamber to ensure the marriage was properly consummated. Because in the ancient world, your most intimate moment wasn't actually yours. It belonged to the state, to the alliance, to the political machinery that had purchased you in the first place. Arsinoe spent her wedding night knowing that men were waiting just beyond the door, listening, making sure the transaction was complete. Ancient sources describe Lysimachus as a man who inspired fear in everyone around him. His court was a place where people disappeared for saying the wrong thing or looking at the king with insufficient respect. And now this terrified 15-year-old Egyptian princess had to navigate that environment while learning to please a husband who saw her primarily as a political asset and secondary breeding stock. Arsinoe gave birth to her first child at 16, then another, then another. 3 sons in rapid succession because that was her job. Produce heirs. Secure the succession. Prove your worth to the man who owned you and the father who sold you. Each pregnancy was potentially fatal. Each birth could have killed her. But that was just the expected risk of being a woman in the ancient world, especially a woman whose only value came from her ability to produce children. The palace at Lysimachia became Arsinoe's prison. She couldn't return to Egypt. Her father had gotten his alliance and moved on to other political concerns. She couldn't divorce Lysimachus. Divorce wasn't an option for royal women who had been sold to secure military treaties. She was trapped in a foreign land, married to a man who terrified her, surrounded by a court that viewed her as an outsider and a threat. But surviving 20 years in Lysimachus's court would turn out to be the easy part of Arsinoe's life, because what waited for her after his death would make her years as a child bride look almost merciful by comparison. Arsinoe spent 20 years married to Lysimachus, 20 years of producing heirs, navigating court politics, and trying to survive in a palace that functioned more like a prison than a home. And during those 2 decades, she watched her husband transform from a merely frightening old man into something far worse. A paranoid tyrant whose grip on reality was slipping with every passing year. Lysimachus had always been violent, that was known. But as he aged, his violence became unpredictable and indiscriminate. He started seeing conspiracies everywhere. Advisors who had served him for decades were suddenly accused of treason and executed. Members of his own family became suspects in imaginary plots. The palace became a place where people spoke in whispers and avoided making eye contact with the king. Then came the moment that showed Arsinoe exactly what kind of man she had been sold to. Lysimachus became convinced that his oldest son, Agathocles, was plotting to overthrow him. There was no real evidence, Just paranoid suspicions and whispered accusations from courtiers who wanted to eliminate a rival. But evidence didn't matter to Lysimachus anymore. He had Agathocles arrested, then tortured, then executed, his own son. The young man who had fought beside him in battles and helped secure his kingdom. Lysimachus ordered him killed based on nothing more than paranoid delusions, and he made sure everyone in the palace knew what happened to people who displeased him, even his own children. Arsinoe had to watch this happen. She had 3 sons of her own by this point, young men who were growing up in this atmosphere of terror. Every time Lysimachus flew into one of his rages, she had to wonder if her children would be next. Would he turn on them the way he had turned on Agathocles? Would he decide that Arsinoe herself was part of some imaginary conspiracy? Life in the palace became a daily exercise in survival. Arsinoe learned to read her husband's moods, to stay out of his way when he was angry, to never say anything that could be interpreted as criticism or disloyalty. She watched other women in the court who weren't as careful. Some were banished, some simply disappeared. The message was clear. Your life belonged to Lysimachus, and he could end it whenever he wanted. But wait, it gets worse. As Lysimachus's paranoia intensified, he became obsessed with the idea that his wives might be unfaithful. He had servants spy on Arsinoe constantly. Her conversations were monitored. Her movements were tracked. She couldn't meet with anyone, even her own sons, without guards present to report back to the king. She was living under constant surveillance in her own home. The physical reality of being married to an increasingly senile old man was its own kind of horror. Lysimachus was in his 70s now, his body falling apart, his mind deteriorating. But he still expected his wives to fulfill their duties. Arsinoe had to maintain the pretense of being a loving spouse to a man she feared and probably despised, all while knowing that any sign of reluctance could be interpreted as treason. Then, in 281 BCE, everything changed. Lysimachus led his army into battle against Seleucus, another of Alexander the Great's former generals. He was 74 years old, far too old to be fighting wars. But his paranoia and ambition drove him forward. The battle was a disaster. Lysimachus's forces were crushed, and Lysimachus himself was killed in the fighting. For about 3 seconds, Arsinoe must have thought she was free. Her nightmare husband was dead. She was 40 years old, with 3 grown sons and significant political connections. Maybe, finally, she could have some control over her own life. She was wrong. Because Lysimachus's death didn't free her. It left her completely vulnerable. Without a husband's protection, without a clear political position, Arsinoe became a target. She had wealth, she had sons who could claim Lysimachus's throne, and she had connections to the Egyptian royal family. That made her simultaneously valuable and dangerous to every ambitious man in the region. Arsinoe fled Lysimachus's kingdom with her 3 sons, heading toward Macedonia, where she hoped to find refuge with other members of the Greek royal families. She thought she was escaping one nightmare. She had no idea she was walking directly into something infinitely worse. Because waiting for her in Macedonia was someone from her own family, someone who would make Lysimachus look almost merciful by comparison. Arsinoe arrived in Macedonia with her 3 sons, exhausted and desperate for protection. She was 40 years old, a widow with no clear political position, and she knew exactly how vulnerable that made her. Women in her situation didn't last long in the Greek world. They were either remarried immediately to secure alliances, or they were eliminated as potential threats. She needed a protector, and she needed one fast. That's when Ptolemy Keraunos appeared. He was Arsinoe's half-brother, son of her father Ptolemy the Fun by a different mother. Keraunos had been passed over for the Egyptian throne in favor of Arsinoe's full brother, Ptolemy II, and he was bitter about it. He had been wandering the Greek world for years, building alliances, and looking for an opportunity to carve out his own kingdom. When Keraunos heard that Arsinoe was in Macedonia, vulnerable and wealthy, he saw his chance. He approached her with what seemed like a generous offer. He would marry her, protect her and her sons, and together they would rule Macedonia. It was a political marriage, yes, but Arsinoe had been through one of those before. At least Curiosities was close to her age and came from her own family. Surely this would be better than being married to ancient Lysimachus. Arsinoe's advisors warned her. They told her that Curiosities was unstable, ambitious, and dangerous. They reminded her that he had spent years nursing grudges against their family. But Arsinoe was desperate. She had 3 sons to protect and no other options. She convinced herself that family loyalty would mean something, that blood ties would keep her safe. The wedding took place quickly, with minimal ceremony. Curiosities was in a hurry to legitimize his claim to Macedonia, and Arsinoe needed the protection that came with being a queen again. She moved into the palace with her sons, finally allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind her. It lasted 3 weeks. One evening, Curiosities hosted a banquet to celebrate his new position as King of Macedonia. The palace was filled with nobles and military commanders, all eager to curry favor with the new ruler. Arsinoe sat beside her new husband, playing the role of supportive queen. Her 3 sons were there too, young men in their late teens and early 20s, finally relaxing after months of fear and uncertainty. Then Curiosities gave a signal. Soldiers burst into the banquet hall with weapons drawn. Before anyone could react, they grabbed Arsinoe's 2 oldest sons. The young men struggled, calling out to their mother, but they were outnumbered and unarmed. Arsinoe lunged from her seat, trying to reach them, screaming at Curiosities to stop. He had her held back, made her watch. The soldiers dragged her sons to the center of the hall and executed them right there, in front of the entire court. Swords through the chest, quick and brutal. Her boys died calling for her, begging for help she couldn't give. Their blood spread across the marble floor while the banquet guests sat frozen in horror. But wait, it gets worse. Curiosities explained his reasoning while Arsinoe's sons were still bleeding out on the floor. He couldn't have potential rivals to his throne. Arsinoe's boys had claims through Lysimachus, claims that could threaten Curiosities' power. So they had to die. It was just politics. Nothing personal. Arsinoe's youngest son managed to escape in the chaos. He fled the palace and eventually made it back to Egypt, the only one of her children to survive. But Arsinoe herself was trapped. Curiosities kept her in the palace for several more days, a prisoner in her own supposed home, surrounded by the memory of her son's murder. She finally escaped with help from sympathetic servants who smuggled her out of the palace at night. Arsinoe fled Macedonia with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and the knowledge that her own half-brother had orchestrated the murder of her children. The marriage had been a trap from the beginning. Curiosities had never intended to share power. He had just wanted to lure Arsinoe and her sons to a place where he could eliminate them without complications. Arsinoe was now 41 years old. She had survived marriage to a paranoid tyrant. She had watched that tyrant execute his own son. And now, she had been forced to witness the murder of her own children by a member of her own family. 2 of her 3 sons were dead. Her half-brother had used her trust against her in the most brutal way imaginable. She had nowhere to go except Egypt, back to the brother who had inherited everything while she had been sold off to Lysimachus decades earlier. Back to Ptolemy II, who now ruled the kingdom that should have been partially hers. She had no money, no political power, no protection. She was damaged goods, a middle-aged widow with a history of catastrophic marriages and dead children. But Ptolemy II welcomed her back. Of course he did. Because he had a use for her. And what he wanted from his sister would make everything she had already endured seem almost merciful by comparison. Ptolemy II had been watching his sister's disasters from the safety of Egypt. He knew about her nightmarish marriage to Lysimachus. He had heard about Curiosities murdering her sons, and he saw an opportunity in her misery. Ptolemy too had a problem. He was the king of Egypt, yes, but his claim to the throne was shakier than he wanted to admit. His father, Ptolemy I, had essentially stolen Egypt after Alexander the Great's death, and the other Greek kingdoms didn't really accept the Ptolemaic dynasty as legitimate. Ptolemy too needed something that would make his rule unquestionable. He needed the kind of divine legitimacy that the old Egyptian pharaohs had possessed. The ancient pharaohs had married their sisters. It was an Egyptian tradition going back thousands of years, a way of keeping the divine bloodline pure and concentrating power within the royal family. The Greek world found this practice disgusting and barbaric. Greeks married for political alliances, sure, but they drew the line at incest. That was something barbarians did, not civilized people. But Ptolemy II didn't care what the Greeks thought. He ruled Egypt, and he wanted to rule it like an Egyptian pharaoh, not a Greek general playing dress-up. If marrying his sister would give him that legitimacy, then that's what he would do. And conveniently, he had a sister who was desperate, broken, and had nowhere else to go. When Arsinoe arrived in Egypt, Ptolemy II let her settle in for a few weeks. Let her feel safe. Let her start to believe that maybe she could live out the rest of her life in quiet obscurity, away from politics and marriage and violence. Then, he made his proposal. He wanted to marry her, his own full sister, the woman who had shared a childhood with him, who had been raised in the same palace, who carried the same blood. Ptolemy II presented it as a practical arrangement. Together they would be the ultimate power couple of the ancient world, co-rulers of Egypt, combining Greek military might with Egyptian divine authority, and Arsinoe would finally have the protection and status she had been denied her entire life. What Ptolemy II didn't mention was that Arsinoe didn't really have a choice. She was 41 years old in a world where women her age had no value unless they were attached to a powerful man. She had no money of her own, no kingdom to return to, no children left to protect. Her only surviving son was too young to help her, and was probably safer if she stayed far away from him. She could either marry Ptolemy II, or she could spend the rest of her life as a charity case, a warning tale about women who lost their usefulness. Arsinoe understood the situation perfectly. This wasn't a loving brother offering to help his sister. This was a king making a business proposal. She would marry him, legitimize his rule, and play the role of devoted sister-wife for the Egyptian public. In return, she would get protection, wealth, and power. It was the same transaction her father had made when he sold her to Lysimachus, just with a different buyer and much more disturbing terms. The announcement sent shockwaves through the Greek world. Even kingdoms that practiced all sorts of brutal politics were disgusted. Sibling marriage was too far, too barbaric, too Egyptian. Ambassadors from other Greek states sent letters questioning Ptolemy II's sanity. How could he do something so revolting? What kind of civilization did he think he was building? But wait, it gets worse. Ptolemy II didn't just marry Arsinoe quietly and hope people would forget about it. He made it a spectacle, a massive public ceremony celebrating the union of brother and sister, complete with Egyptian religious rituals that declared them divine. The marriage wasn't just legal, it was holy. Blessed by the gods themselves, according to the Egyptian priests who had every reason to support whatever the pharaoh wanted. Arsinoe stood through the ceremony in Egyptian royal regalia, playing her part perfectly. She had spent her entire life being sold, traded, and used by men. This was just one more transaction. At least this time she was getting something out of it. Real power. Real influence. A position that couldn't be taken away by another man's whims. The wedding night must have been surreal. Arsinoe was in bed with her own brother, the boy she had played with as a child, now a man who saw her primarily as a political tool. This wasn't some distant relative or half-sibling she barely knew. This was her full brother. Same mother, same father, same childhood. And now he was her husband. But the psychological horror of the incest was only part of Arsinoe's new nightmare. Because Ptolemy II already had a wife, a woman named Arsinoe I, no family relation, whom he had married years earlier, and Ptolemy II had no intention of divorcing her. Not immediately, anyway. Which meant Arsinoe II would have to share her brother-husband with another woman, at least until she could maneuver the first wife out of the picture. After surviving 2 catastrophic marriages and the murder of her children, Arsinoe had finally returned home, and the price of that homecoming was marrying her own brother while competing with his existing wife for position and influence. The girl who had been sold at 15 had become a woman who willingly entered into incest because it was the least terrible option available. Arsinoe too thought marrying her brother would at least give her security, a clear position, undisputed power. She was wrong, because Ptolemy Seku's first wife, Arsinoe, was still very much present in the palace, still very much queen, and Ptolemy too saw no reason to resolve this situation quickly. For months, both women occupied the royal palace simultaneously. Two queens, both named Arsinoe, both married to the same man, both competing for influence and status. It was psychological warfare disguised as domestic arrangement. Every meal, every public ceremony, every royal decision became a battlefield where the two women fought for position. Arsinoe. I had advantages. She was younger, had already given Ptolemy II 3 children, and had been his wife for years. She knew the palace staff, had established relationships with key advisors, and wasn't tainted by the scandal of being the king's sister. She also wasn't desperate. She had options if the marriage failed. Arsinoe Seku had different advantages. She was older, more experienced in court politics, and carried the mystique of having survived multiple royal households. She also had something Arsinoe I could never claim. She was Ptolemy II's full sister, which gave their marriage religious significance in Egyptian eyes. The priests supported her because sibling marriage fit their ancient traditions. But wait, it gets worse. Ptolemy II played both women against each other deliberately. He would show favor to Arsinoe one week, attending ceremonies with her and giving her gifts. Then he would pivot to Arsinoe II the next week, making public displays of their partnership and consulting her on political decisions. He kept both women off balance, competing for his attention, never quite secure in their positions. Arsinoe too realized she was in another survival situation. She had thought returning to Egypt would mean safety, but instead she found herself in a different kind of cage. She couldn't leave. She couldn't divorce Ptolemy II. She had nowhere to go, and no resources outside his control. If she wanted actual power and security, she had to eliminate her rival, the campaign against Arsinoe. I was subtle and vicious. Arsinoe II used every political skill she had learned from decades of navigating deadly courts. She whispered to the right advisors, made strategic alliances with Egyptian priests who preferred the traditional sister marriage, positioned herself as the legitimate Egyptian queen while painting Arsinoe as a foreign interloper with no real claim to the throne. It took time, but eventually Arsinoe II won. Arsinoe I was accused of plotting against the king. The evidence was thin, probably fabricated, but that didn't matter. She was stripped of her titles, separated from her children, and exiled from Egypt, sent away to live in obscurity while Arsinoe II took her place completely. Arsinoe Seku had become exactly what she needed to be to survive. Ruthless, calculating, willing to destroy another woman to secure her own position. The girl who had been sold at 15 had learned that mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford. But her victory came with a devastating realization. She was now 45 years old. Her body had been through 3 pregnancies decades earlier, had endured years of stress and trauma, and was simply worn out. Ptolemy too expected her to produce heirs with him. That was part of the arrangement. A sister wife who couldn't give him children was just a political liability. Arsinoe tried. Ancient medical texts describe the various treatments available to women struggling with fertility. Herbal concoctions that were probably toxic. Physical manipulations that were definitely painful. Rituals and prayers to various gods. She subjected herself to all of it, desperate to fulfill this one final requirement that would make her position unassailable. Nothing worked. Her body, damaged by early pregnancies and decades of trauma, couldn't or wouldn't cooperate. Month after month, year after year, no pregnancy. Ptolemy too grew frustrated. The whole point of their marriage was to produce divinely legitimate heirs. If Arsinoe couldn't do that, what was the point of enduring the scandal of sibling marriage? The palace whispered. Courtiers speculated about whether Ptolemy II would divorce Arsinoe and marry someone else. Egyptian priests assured him that the gods had already blessed the marriage and children weren't necessary for divine legitimacy. But everyone knew the truth. A queen who couldn't produce heirs was a queen living on borrowed time. Arsinoe threw herself into governing. She became Ptolemy Seku's co-ruler, in fact, not just title. She attended military councils, made diplomatic decisions, and helped manage Egypt's vast wealth. Her face appeared on coins alongside her brother husbands. Temples were built honoring both of them as divine siblings. She made herself so politically valuable that Ptolemy II couldn't afford to discard her, even without heirs. But the strain was showing. Ancient sources describe Arsinoe in her final years as increasingly isolated and focused on work. She had eliminated her rival, secured her position, and gained real power. But she was alone. Her children were dead, murdered decades earlier. Her family connections had been twisted into incestuous marriage. Her body had failed her one final time. She had won every political battle, but the cost was everything that made her human. Arsinoe II had spent her entire life being used by men, sold by her father, terrorized by her first husband, betrayed by her half-brother, manipulated by her brother-husband. And now, in her mid-40s, she was still performing, still playing the role of devoted sister-wife, still pretending that this was somehow a victory rather than just a different form of the same captivity she had endured since age 15. The real horror wasn't what had been done to her. It was what she had become in order to survive it. A woman so hardened by trauma that she could destroy a rival without hesitation, so desperate for security that she would marry her own brother, so damaged by decades of abuse that she measured success by how well she could manipulate the people around her. Arsinoe II died in July of 270 BCE. She was approximately 46 years old, though exact ages are hard to pin down for ancient figures. The official cause of death wasn't recorded, but based on descriptions of her final months, modern medical historians suspect uterine or ovarian cancer. The disease probably manifested as abdominal pain that grew progressively worse, bleeding that wouldn't stop, and a gradual wasting away that no ancient physician could treat or even properly diagnose. Her final weeks were agonizing. Ancient medical texts described treatments for such conditions, and they were all useless at best and torturous at worst. Physicians would have tried bloodletting, which just made her weaker. Herbal poultices that did nothing for internal tumors. Prayers and offerings to various gods who remained conspicuously silent. Arsinoe probably knew she was dying weeks before the end. She had seen enough death in her life to recognize it approaching. And she had to face the bitter irony that after everything she had survived, after all the political maneuvering and calculated sacrifices, her own body was killing her in a way that no amount of power or influence could stop. When she finally died, Ptolemy II faced a problem. His sister-wife's death created a political vacuum. Their marriage had been controversial from the start, and now he needed to justify it retroactively. He needed to convince Egypt and the wider Greek world that his decision to marry his sister had been not just acceptable, but divinely ordained. So Ptolemy II did what powerful men always do when faced with inconvenient reality. He rewrote it. He declared Arsinoe II a goddess, not metaphorically, not as a symbolic honor. He established an actual religious cult around her, with temples, priests, and official worship. Arsinoe Philadelphus, the brother-loving goddess, became one of Egypt's official deities. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. Official histories were rewritten to portray Arsinoe as a wise and beloved queen who had brought prosperity to Egypt. Her controversial marriages were glossed over or reframed as political necessities. Her ruthless elimination of the first Arsinoe was conveniently forgotten. She became a sanitized icon, stripped of everything human and complicated. But wait, it gets worse. While Ptolemy II was building temples and establishing worship rituals for his deified sister-wife, her actual body was going through the mummification process. And it wasn't going well. Egyptian mummification in 270 BCE was an advanced art. Priests had been perfecting the process for thousands of years. But Arsinoe's body presented unusual challenges. If she had died of cancer, her internal organs would have been in advanced states of decay even before death. Tumors break down tissue. Internal bleeding creates pools of corrupted blood. The disease process essentially starts decomposing the body while the person is still alive. The embalmers would have opened her body according to standard procedure, removing organs through an incision in the side. But instead of finding healthy tissue to preserve, they probably discovered a mess of diseased organs, tumors, and tissue that was already breaking down. The smell alone would have been overwhelming. These were professionals who dealt with death daily, but even they must have struggled with what they found inside Egypt's newest goddess. Ancient Egyptian preservation techniques worked best on bodies that were relatively healthy at death. Arsinoe's body was anything but healthy. The embalming process likely failed to fully preserve her remains, despite the priest's best efforts. Her corpse would have continued deteriorating inside the elaborate wrappings, slowly rotting inside the expensive sarcophagus that Ptolemy II commissioned. And here's the final grotesque irony. While Arsinoe's actual body was decomposing in its tomb, statues of her were being erected throughout Egypt. Beautiful carved images showing her as an idealized queen, forever young and perfect. Temples were built where priests performed daily rituals honoring her divine presence. Ptolemy II commissioned poems and inscriptions celebrating her wisdom and beauty. The woman who had been sold at 15, terrorized by her first husband, who had watched her sons murdered by her half-brother, who had been forced to marry her own brother out of desperation. This woman was now being worshipped as a goddess. But only the sanitized fake version. The statue version, not the real Arsinoe who had suffered and schemed and survived through decades of horror. Her cult lasted for centuries after her death. Future Ptolemaic queens took her name, trying to claim some of her supposed divine status. Cities were named after her. Festivals were held in her honor. Priests collected offerings at her temples and performed elaborate rituals celebrating her godhood. But none of it was real. It was all political theater. Propaganda designed to legitimize Ptolemy II's dynasty and justify the incestuous marriage that had scandalized the Greek world. The real Arsinoe, the woman who had been bought and sold and used and broken, was just rotting meat inside an expensive box. The cruelest irony is that Arsinoe only achieved security and respect after she was dead. While alive, she was valuable only for what she could provide to the men who controlled her. As a corpse, she became priceless. Her dead body and manufactured legend were worth more to Ptolemy II than she had ever been while breathing. This is what happened to women in the ancient world, even queens. They were used while useful, discarded when convenient, and sometimes posthumously transformed into propaganda tools. Arsinoe II survived more trauma than most people could imagine. She outlived 2 catastrophic marriages, witnessed her children's murder, and made herself powerful enough that her brother-husband couldn't dispose of her. But in the end, she only got the respect she had fought for her entire life after she was too dead to appreciate it. The temples to Arsinoe Philadelphus eventually fell into ruin. Her cult faded away as new rulers came to power and different gods became fashionable. Her elaborate tomb was probably looted centuries ago, her mummy scattered or destroyed. Nothing remains of the actual woman except some coins bearing her image and scattered historical references to her various disasters. But the lesson remains. Power in the ancient world demanded human sacrifices, and women like Arsinoe were the ones being sacrificed. She wasn't unique. She was just better documented than most. Thousands of other royal women were sold into marriages, trapped in abusive households, and used up until they had nothing left to give. Arsinoe II was declared a goddess, but she died like everyone else dies. Alone, in pain, with her body falling apart and all her political achievements about to be rewritten by someone else. The only difference was that her suffering was commemorated with temples and statues, turned into entertainment for future generations who would never have to endure what she endured. That's the real horror of Arsinoe's story. Not that it happened, but that it was completely normal for the time. This was just how royal marriages worked in the ancient world. Women were currency, daughters were investments. And if you survived long enough, maybe someone would build you a temple after you died and pretend your life had been noble and divinely blessed, rather than what it actually was, 50 years of being someone else's property.